no more distractions. No more electric tanks, no more gender confusion, no more climate change worship. We are laser focused on our mission of warfighting.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into. It's called peace through strength.
You look into the eyes of these young Americans who are giving up the best years of their life in a uniform to serve their nation. They are incredible.
Through our power and might, we will lead the world to peace. Our friends will respect us, our enemies will fear us, and the whole world will admire the unrivaled greatness of the United States military.
Well, I suppose most military ads are somewhat inspirational, but you can see this was getting away from those collateral missions of gender equity and pronouns and getting back to the basic business of lethality. Compare that new tone. And by the way, I hear that recruitment in the U.S. military is dramatically up. Well, let me show you a video I stumbled across. The algorithm sent it my way. I saw this on TikTok. Here is a former combat officer in the Canadian Armed Forces who is a lawyer as well. And he talks about something I didn't know was going on in the Canadian Armed Forces called Flipflop Fridays. Here, take a look. We'll watch for a minute.
Here's a way to know your military is in a crisis. It's when they have something called Flip-Flop Fridays. So the general of the Canadian Armed Forces determined that it was somewhat triggering to have to wear combat uniforms 5 days a week. So they started casual Fridays. Not of the civilians, but of the serving apparent war fighters now have casual Fridays, but what is now being called in Ottawa Flip-Flop Fridays. So what I want to suggest is some other days for the military to reduce the triggering element that warriors can get by having to wear combat uniforms. I think we should have Misgender Me Mondays, which means you should have 4 name tags on your combat uniform. And if somebody misgenders you, you should immediately lose your shit and start yelling at people. And then maybe trigger Tuesdays. Maybe Tuesdays, you should just go through the military and just look for a reason to be triggered and then write that and tell your boss about it. There's obviously Woke Wednesdays. Maybe on Woke Wednesdays, everybody should dye their hair or get a couple extra piercings. What I'm saying is when the Canadian Armed Forces doesn't allow the use of warrior and has Flip-Flop Fridays and is wondering why we can't recruit new people to the military, they might want to take a look south of the border. Because whether or not you want to feel morally superior to Trump or the US, the reality is that their military's recruiting has gone through the roof. Their retention has improved dramatically. Why? Because they're focusing on lethality and a warrior culture. That's what attracts people to your military. They know their target audience. The Canadian Armed Forces have become a social policy tool to try to influence how people see the world rather than focusing on defending this nation to protect our citizens from enemies of the state.
Well, there he is, Phillip Millar. I thought some of the things he was talking about there were jokes, but they are not jokes. And we know that they wouldn't be jokes because this is the Canadian Armed Forces that installed tampon dispensers in men's washrooms across military bases in this country. Joining us now via Skype is that rogue lawyer, as he calls himself, Phillip Millar. Phillip, thanks very much for taking the time to be with us.
How are you, sir?
I thought that was great. I thought it was very funny. And at first I thought you were kidding. I didn't know your background. And so I thought, well, who's this guy talking about, casual Fridays in the military? And not for the civilian staff, for the actual soldiers. Tell me more about that. Let me just confirm, is that a real thing? Do our military, like actual combat troops, have casual Fridays in the Canadian Armed Forces?
I don't want to disclose my sources, but I was called by somebody who went up to Ottawa Senior, and he was a combat guy, and he was losing his crap because people were walking around in shorts, and he was asking about it. And they said that they instituted a policy for soldiers, sailors, and air staff to have a casual Friday. And, he saw somebody with flip-flops. He called me and goes, I can't talk about it. Can you do a video? So I did a video on it. I also did a video about going up to my old base in Petawawa and seeing what used to be a hardcore base of trigger pullers look like something out of the Star Wars Cantana. So I've kind of taken it quite personally that, social policy is trumping lethality right now. The triggered Tuesdays, the Misgender Me Mondays, that's all me just doing a little license there. But I thought it certainly caught with a bunch of people.
Now, who is behind this? Is this from within the military? Is this a direction from the government? Because I've got to think that, I mean, I suppose it's like the police forces. The brass know that to get ahead, you've got to be woke. But at the end of the day, it's a killing business. Or as Trump alluded to in his ad, hopefully you're strong enough to deter violence. Who's behind this?
It's the cadre from the Liberal government. And, I've never been that political, but I've just seen what it's done to the military. There is a Liberal government that came from Trudeau to push social policy onto the department they considered the most toxic, masculine department. And so it's a beautiful target for them to show how powerful they are by essentially attacking toxic masculinity and all of the things that are characteristic of a fighting force that can get the job done. It's not to say there's not room for diversity in the military, but I almost get the sense they're laughing at how ridiculous they're making the military in terms of just nonstop virtue signaling, rainbow flags, tampons everywhere, and nonsensical things that just make warfighters want to run away from this organization. And then they can't figure out why recruiting isn't up. It's because Starbucks baristas don't want to go live in a trench or go into a jungle or jump out of a plane. Like, there's a cognitive dissonance that is affecting Canada to the detriment of our national security.
I think you're onto something there. I think of other masculine institutions where masculine traits were deliberately attacked. I think of the NFL. I think of NASCAR, how they were, I think of Bud Light, how they were
hockey.
Yeah, colonized and emasculated from within, which was very disoriented to guys who just like to watch some football or like to watch some hockey. And I mean, I don't know how those are working out commercially for those sports franchises. In a way, I don't care what they do, but the military is something that, we actually need it. We rely on it. And those traits that are considered too masculine, that's precisely what we need in our military, because the other guys' militaries are testosterone driven. It's based on strength and strategy, not, feelings and, consensus building. Tell me about the new boss of the military. What's her name?
General Jenny Kerrigan, French-Canadian lady. But the interesting thing is she ran a department, moved through the ranks very quickly, but ran a department called the Office of Protocol and Professional Standards, which seems somewhat Stalinistic, and it was created under Trudeau to kind of police, I think, thought and behavior in the military, because they became very concerned with not wanting scandals. What's factually true is when they kind of destroyed the careers of 4 or 5 of our top generals based on allegations alone, she was well below them, but she was also in this department that was in charge of reporting on people, almost like a Politburo. And as each of them got canceled and moved away, she moved up the ranks and became the chief of defense staff. And, interestingly enough, something that I'm sensitive to is it costs about $30 million in 3 decades to make a general. And if you wanted to destabilize Canada and you were one of our adversaries, all you had to do was have somebody make an allegation against a general, and they were fired and removed from the Canadian Armed Forces structure permanently. And what we've seen is 5 generals, absolute careers destroyed, and I represented one of them, on allegations alone. None of them actually turned out to be supportable in court. And we just saw a complete transformation of the leadership of the Canadian Armed Forces. And everybody who is in there now has gotten the message to play ball or your career is over. And they're literally, it's sad to say, a bunch of terrified senior officers there that privately lament for how bad the military is, but publicly can't say anything and have to look obedient.
One thing I used to look at was, I think it's called Operation Maple Flag, if I'm remembering. It was the sort of the Top Gun exercises in Cold Lake, Alberta, where Canada invited air forces from across NATO to compete. And then suddenly a few years ago, they said, we're putting it on hold for, they came up with some weird word like logistical reasons or something, but they never started it up again. And my theory was that we just simply didn't have the hardware, didn't have enough working planes that could go shoulder to shoulder with the F-22s and F-35s and whatever else our allies were flying, that it was a combination of lack of money, lack of equipment, and maybe even lack of people. But they certainly have time for these Me Too exercises or these diversity exercises. What do you know anything about Maple Flag and the cancellation of it?
I don't know anything about Maple Flag being a grunt infantry airborne officer, but what I do know is that the military is the one place where merit means more than anything, and they've actually kind of gone on a campaign against meritocracy. And that's actually what's kind of, I think, characterizing our society right now, especially from the Liberal government, is to attack merit-based selection so that we can promote, communities that look the way they want them to look. But when it comes to going into battle, what I always found about the military, even when I got out into law, is it had some issues, but generally it was fairly fair, because what I cared about is could you cover my six, not who you were sleeping with, not where you were from. It's just we wanted to survive and we wanted to do the mission. And I thought it was a very positive place. It had room for improvement, but it has just been infected by that woke mind virus. And everybody will tell you that privately, unless they're trying to get a promotion echoing what the government wants them to say. It is an organization that is in a spiral and cannot do anything. And it doesn't matter how many elbows up T-shirts you sell. I don't know if any blue-haired baristas are going to protect Canada when push comes to shove.
Well, and that's the thing is when you reduce the standards of, do you have, how do you dress? How do you groom yourself? There are standards for being in the military, and hiring some they, them baristas maybe checks some boxes. But how many of those folks want to be in the military? If you are obsessed with social justice, progressive sexuality, let's say, are you even oriented towards being in the military? I don't know. I mean, maybe there are a lot of trans people who say, I want to drive a tank and I want to fly a jet, but I just don't see it as part of the same worldview.
There's going to be some, and people should be welcomed in based on performance. But, the problem is recruiting is at a critical low level. Nobody is talking about the actual numbers. And nobody is allowed to say what's true. Like, we're in this alternate universe where people are pretending everything is okay, and nobody will tell the emperor they have no clothes because you just get fired.
Let me ask you about the new announcement by Mark Carney of beefing up the armed forces. I've heard the Liberal Party say everything and anything on this, and historically they have been a laggard based on the amount of our GDP spent on the military. What do you make of Mark Carney's latest statement that he's actually going to fast forward the spending and catch up? Do you believe it?
I think I have an interesting angle here, because I've taken some flack because I've suggested that Trump's a good negotiator and told some delicate flowers not to freak out at what he says. Carney has an internal audience in Canada and an external audience. Trump essentially said, NATO has to spend 2% members or else you're going to have problems. Carney was going to do it by 2030. Now, all of a sudden, he's doing it this year. He wants Canadians to think it's because he's trying to protect us from Trump. Really what he's doing what he's been told by Trump. Trump said, do 2% spending or else. He said, I do it by 2030. And all of a sudden, we're doing it now. But now he has to sell it to the Canadians by pretending that France is going to come and save us if we get into a sovereignty battle in our Arctic. It's pure cognitive dissonance.